Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's seminar. I'm George Blumenthal. I'm the director of the Berkeley Center for the Studies in Higher Education and the former chancellor at UC Santa Cruz. And I want to welcome you to today's talk, which thinks about the very important question, is free tuition a good idea? Now, before we begin today's talk, I'd like to set a few ground rules. First of all, we're going to have a conversation with our two speakers, who I'll introduce in a moment. But for those of you who are watching this via our YouTube channel, you do have an opportunity to submit questions. Just submit questions via the chat function on YouTube. You may have to log into YouTube using either a YouTube or a Google login and password in order to ask the question via chat. But I encourage you to do so, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can during the course of the next hour. So with that, let me introduce our two speakers today. First, let me introduce Carol Christ, who is the 11th Chancellor and former Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost of the University of California at Berkeley. Previously, she served as the President of Smith College from 2002 to 2013, and before that, she was a professor of English and an administrator at Berkeley for more than 3 decades. Chancellor Christ is an advocate for quality, accessible public higher education, a proponent of the value of a broad education in the liberal arts and sciences, and a champion of women's issues and diversity on college campuses. Since her return to Berkeley, she has worked to foster community and improve the campus climate, strengthen Berkeley's financial position, and address the campus's housing shortage, and celebrate the institution's longstanding commitment to free speech. I might also add, she also served for a year as the director of the Center for Studies in Higher Education before becoming provost again. Our second speaker is David Kirk, who is a Goldman School of Public Policy professor emeritus and a professor of the Graduate School. He's a past winner of the Outstanding Teacher Award. He's the author of 18 books and scores of articles, with his most recent book being The College Dropout Scandal, published by Oxford University Press. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Education, a contributing writer for the New York Times and a frequent contributor to the Los Angeles Times. Kirk is a member of Obama's presidential transition team and is a consultant to the Biden Education Policy Group. So I want to welcome both of you to today's discussion. Let me begin the discussion by turning to Chancellor Christ and asking you the very simple question, is free tuition a good idea?
Thank you, George, for that question. I think it's the wrong question. There is a very interesting book by the William Bowen and Michael McPherson called Lesson Plan, in which they talk about higher education, the questions facing it. And they say there are 3 funding sources in higher education. There is tuition. There is government and state support, particularly for public institutions, and there's philanthropy. And I think the right question is what the relationship of those 3 sources of funding should be. There's been a huge shift over the last about 2 decades of the burden of cost of higher education, particularly in public institutions, from the state to students and their families. And I think the current controversy about tuition stems from that shift. But we're just asking the wrong question if we're asking, should college be free or should tuition be free? We have to think about how college in different kinds of institutions should be funded.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Carol that it is the wrong question to ask, and I want to take the conversation back 40 years ago and longer, when the assumption was that education was what economists call a public good. That is, it benefits all of us, benefits the state, it benefits other people, and therefore, as a public good, it should be funded mostly by the public. And beginning around 1980, attitudes began to change, and the assumption was in a sense, education was hoist by its own petard. People kept saying, look how much money people are making when they get degrees. You get a BA and you've got a huge windfall. And the public officials and taxpayers started saying, well, if that's true, then let's treat education as a private good. That is to say, it's like buying something. So if you buy something, you don't expect the state to subsidize you. And so I don't think that educators have done a great job of making the case for the public mission of the university in a way that Joe and Jane Citizen can really understand. And so that's where we are at this stage of the game. I mean, not yet able to make a case, not for universal free public education, because I agree with the Chancellor, that is the wrong question. But how is it that you acknowledge that there ought to be a larger public role in the funding of higher education?
David, I'm curious. David Hollinger has often made the argument to me. David Hollinger, for the audience, is an emeritus professor of history, works in American intellectual history. And he's often made the argument to me that this shift in attitudes toward education and who should pay for higher education came at the very time that the student bodies across the country were becoming much more diverse. And so he was suggesting a relationship between that breakdown of the social compact of higher education being a public good and the increasing diversity of higher education. Do you think that that's a sound argument or not?
Well, I always find David's arguments interesting, and I think there's something to it. If you look at the K-12 system, you'll see a direct relationship between the amount of money over a long period of time until very recently. The decline in funding for public education is directly correlated with the increase in minority and poor kids. That is to say, in both of these cases, the taxpayer feels it's not us funding us, which is the way it was before. It's us funding them. And the them in this case are the underrepresented families and students. And so it is easier to cut back on costs. I do think it lets the university off the hook a bit, because this is also the time when universities start talking in business terms in a way they never did before. And so, okay, if it's a business and universities are in theory making money now from patents for the first time, going back to 1980, those used to be treated as public goods. Now the universities can earn money. Never mind that most of them don't, but that's out there in the world. And again, I think that the combination of the change in who the student body is, the difference in the national climate, this is Ronald Reagan running against government and very effectively doing so. It's the time of Prop 13, and higher education to some extent gets caught in that crossfire. So it's not the protagonist of this story. It's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Hamlet. But they don't do very well, those guys. And higher education hasn't done very well either.
Could I just interject a question? I mean, if we go back to 1960 and the origin of the master plan for higher education in California, the master plan was very clear that public higher education in all three segments should be free. And in fact, that continued for on the order of a decade, or maybe a little bit more, until basically Ronald Reagan came in as governor. And yes, there was the issue of increasing diversity at the university, but there was also the issue of increasing protest at universities that undercut a great deal of credibility. Do you think that played a role? And do you think the clock is ever capable of being turned back?
Well, I think it certainly played a role. I think there were multiple political and social factors that bore on this massive shift in the funding of higher education. But I'm unfortunately rather pessimistic about the clock being turned back, largely because of both the tax structure of the country, that there are all of these movements to reduce taxes, and you can't have high public benefits like free college education if you don't have a tax structure that supports them. And also the priorities of the state have changed. We have our massive, prison population and monies devoted to prisons. Healthcare is a much more substantial substantial ingredient of state budgets. So I think even if there were better will, I just don't see the financial foundation to support more investment in higher education. David, you may have other views about this.
I'm modestly more optimistic. I mean, I absolutely agree with everything that you said, but I'm modestly more optimistic given the political leadership in Sacramento now and the willingness to talk about, for example, reducing prison costs, and the hope for change in the White House, because the plan that Joe Biden has put forth for higher education is a whole lot more sensible. Well, anything would be a whole lot more sensible, but it's a whole lot more sensible than what we have in place now. And it acknowledges that for families earning $125,000 a year, which these days has become middle class in California, if you've got a kid or certainly two kids going to college, it's a huge stretch. And that's true nationally. So creating finding public dollars to support those kids is a really important thing to do. And I think it's on the Biden agenda, but as you're suggesting, Carol, there are lots of things on the Biden agenda, just as there are lots of things on the Gavin Newsom agenda. And it's not clear to me where higher education stands. You can't have it all. And so, in deciding, for example, between early education, very underfunded early education, and higher education in a world of limited resources, where the public dollar is going to go, I think that's unclear at this point. If I were advising leaders in higher education, like yourself, Chancellor, I would say that the very best thing to do in obtaining more money is to lash yourself to the pre-K through K-12 system and treat it as one large education system. So rather than thinking about funding higher education, you start thinking about funding opportunities for the next generation, which is pre-K through post-grad, and making that a political pitch, not just a rhetorical argument.
I wonder whether you differentiate. I read the Biden plan with your encouragement last night, and I wonder if you would differentiate between community colleges and four-year colleges and universities. A lot of the argument for free tuition is directed specifically at the community college system, and I'm curious about that.
This is a hard one. The overwhelming majority of underserved students, of poor students, of students of color, Latino students, African-American students, start in community colleges. They are the gateway to higher education. And unfortunately, for most of these students, and I do mean most of these students, they are the end of higher education, because even if you create a 6-year time span to finish 2 years of community college, 60% of the students don't make it. And indeed, I looked at the data. If you took students in the state of Tennessee, which pioneered the free community college plan, and where 16% of the students graduated in 2 years, if you took those students and sent them to one of the regional universities in Tennessee, should not have, Middle Tennessee State is the one I looked at, don't have enormously high admission standards, are essentially open admission schools, half those students graduate. So unless you figure out, and this is one of the things that's interesting about the Biden plan and an improvement over the campaign rhetoric on the subject that Biden offered, free is not enough unless you figure out a way of engaging those students, supporting them as full-time students, which doubles the chances they will graduate, and creating the kind of smooth pathways between community colleges and universities, which means university professors and community college professors collaborating on the development of common lower division courses, so that the community college students come in as well prepared as the true freshmen are. Now, one of the interesting pieces of data at Berkeley is, and you know this better than I, is that the graduation rate for community college transfers and four-year students is the same. The only difference is when I last looked, community college students graduated slightly quicker than their four-year students. And I think that's because those students are hungry. You know, why am I teaching at Berkeley and not at Stanford? Because Stanford doesn't, this is not something that's interesting to Stanford, but for me to have that mix of students, the kind of hungry first generation students in that class, you know, along with the more privileged and, you know, economically well-heeled students is great. It's great for the institution. But there are models out there as to how to do this, how you support those students in community college, what kinds of personal supports they get, how you develop ties between the community colleges and the universities. If you can do that, then I think it does make sense to make community college free, because again, you look at the population you're talking about as an overwhelmingly low-income population.
Yeah, although I've been struck by the data, which I'm sure you have too, and you really referred to it in your Tennessee example, that that students who start at four-year institutions and study after study have a better chance of getting a bachelor's degree than students with the intention of getting a bachelor's degree who start at community colleges do. And I've often wondered about California's investment, enormous investment in its community college system, given that, I mean, California is low. In fact, I think the data I saw was that it was the lowest in the country, the percentage of places in four-year institutions in relationship to the size of the population. So it seems to me there are many ways in which we're underinvesting in higher education, and one of them is just capacity itself, and the other is that I do believe higher education should be more subsidized than it currently is.
Indeed, if you look across the country, though, at what City University of New York has done, and I wrote about this in the dropout scandal. I mean, they've built a program that, you know, in which those students do transfer and they graduate from four-year schools, but it requires money. It requires engagement on the part of faculty, in particular, at least staff. It requires somebody whom the students can say, that person has my back. You know, she's like my mom, she's like my big sister. And that works, and it works for four-year schools as well as two-year schools, because they've taken this model, they've applied it to a four-year university in that system with a low graduation rate. And the first round study, they almost double the graduation rate. So you need to do a lot of work in revamping both the community colleges and how they operate, and the relationship between the university and the community college. I would love it if more poor students went to four-year schools. I mean, this is what makes Berkeley and UCLA so extraordinary, right? That the number of Pell Grant students, the number of first-gen students, the number of students whose income is below poverty line. I mean, that's extraordinary, but it's not America. And I think if you're going to get, those students are America. Those students are America's future. Increasing in numbers and increasing in talent. And you got to figure out a way, universities have got to figure out a way to make themselves more welcoming environments. And that does require for poor students, not just subsidizing tuition. I mean, we forget that, that students spend as much on living expenses as they do on tuition. And that we don't tend to think about. Many schools require that you pay for your own healthcare. They don't cover that. Students spend more than students spend more than $1,000 a year on textbooks. That has to be built in some way. That has to be built in this. And there are ways of doing this. There are ways of cutting the cost of textbooks, for example, by renting them to students for the year, and then the university buying them and renting them to students for a year. But I agree with you that there ought to be larger subsidies for higher education. I think that we agree as well, they should be need-based. They also should expand institutions with a proven track record of success, because that's where that's where the greatest impact is going to be on these students' lives. But we're back, to the point that you made earlier about, your pessimism and my semi-pessimism about how you make that case. How do you get up there on a public stage? And how do you find a forum that really, gets you beyond Princeton University Press, which published, Derek Bell's book, or Oxford University Press, which published mine, into the larger conversation?
Yeah, there's a. I just want to. I just
Go
wanted
ahead,
to
Carol.
say there's this historic gift that's just been made to the California community college system of $100 million from the Pritzker Foundation. And I hope it's used to create the very programs that you're talking about. But I wanted to pick up on your last point because it relates to a very good question in the chat. The student financial aid system does cover tuition for low-income students. Wouldn't greater publication of this fact help in justifying tuition? Yes, indeed, that's true. First of all, half the students, more than half the students at the University of California don't pay tuition. It's covered by financial aid. And also, even the tuition that in-state students are charged only covers half the cost of instruction. But what people they don't focus on is, first of all, I agree with the questioner that we don't do a very good job of explaining that. But what people don't focus on is the cost of living, of room and board. And one of the, I think, little known, little understood facts about holding tuition frozen is that it then limits the amount of financial aid you have for those other expenses that all students have, because it means that the financial aid budget isn't going up with the policy the University of California has about the 33% return to aid. And so even if tuition isn't increasing, those other costs are increasing, and universities don't have a way of, other than philanthropy, increasing the financial aid pot if tuition is frozen in order to create more generous aid packages for most needy students.
So are both of you saying then that if you have an extra amount of money to invest in higher education, and if your goal is to increase the number of people who graduate from four-year institutions, you would be better off investing that money in either student aid for housing or in student support services to help get people through, rather than in lowering tuition, that would be a better investment in terms of achieving the goal of greater throughput?
Lowering overall, yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, free tuition was a great slogan, right? And I'm sure, Bill Gates's kids would love the chance to go to university free. And if we had, if we had lots and lots and lots of money, yeah, it's an okay thing to do. But we would be best off with a high tuition, high subsidy policy.
Yeah.
Let the wealthy pay full freight, and let the poor and middle class kids come to school for little, if any, money, and support them not just in terms of tuition, but in terms of their other expenses. And free tuition. These are great political slogans, right? You've got to find a way, and I'm talking politically because these are political questions, not just policy questions. You've got to find a way to be clear and straightforward as to why it is that the best thing to do is to support students on the basis of need, not just to wipe out tuition or to freeze tuition.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
As ever, this seems to be a pattern with us, Chancellor.
Well, maybe we can find an area where you disagree. Can we talk a little bit about a comparison of the tuition model in the United States to that in Europe, where public higher education is often free in certain countries, and how you see that comparison working?
Sorry. The difficulty with these comparisons is they pull out one thing like higher education and say, gosh, it's free in lots of Europe. Why isn't it free here? Well, the reason is that those countries have made a very different bargain in terms of what the role of the collective is going to be, and what people are willing to pay taxes for to get the kind of support they have. I've been spending a lot of time in Finland. I mean, higher education is free. So is primary and secondary education. So is healthcare. So is subsidized housing. So is a lot of support for childcare. The income structure is much, much, much flatter than it is in the US. And the willingness to pay taxes, which is diminishing in this country, is constant there. The trust of government is enormous. The prime minister confidence in the prime minister now polls at 88%, confidence in the president polls at 90%. Imagine those numbers. So it's in that world, yeah, in that world, you can have free higher education. But that isn't where we are. That isn't where we are now. That's, you know, that's to become social democrats, not socialists, as Bernie Sanders incorrectly said. That's to create a social democracy. And you know, maybe not in my lifetime, maybe in the next generation's lifetime, we'll move closer in that direction, but I don't see it.
Yeah, I agree completely with David. I think you can't separate the financial support of higher education from tax structure, at least public higher education from tax structure. And as long as we are a nation that resists taxation, it's very difficult to imagine free higher education. It's really part of a package. If you are a high benefits country, you also have to be a high taxation country, but you can't be high benefits, low taxation. It just doesn't work.
But it is still true that in the United States today, 70% of all bachelor's degrees are awarded by public universities.
Right.
So the public higher education system is key to our success. But it's also true that today the United States has now fallen from first to 17th in the world in terms of the percentage of 25 to 30-year-olds who hold bachelor's degrees. So in terms of American competitiveness going forward with the rest of the world, we need to be doing something to improve or increase the number of college graduates that we're producing. So if tuition isn't the right way to do it, what is the right way to do this?
Yeah, I've often wondered whether it's possible to have a much more transparent system of pricing for public higher education. Right now, you know, we have everybody's charged full tuition and then people get financial aid. But I wonder whether you could have a progressive pricing that would make it clearer how we're using financial aid. That it seems to me, I mean, but part of the problem is people don't really seem to understand, both at publics and at privates, what a big role financial aid plays.
Well, they see what they see. Absolutely, what they see is the sticker price, and what they don't see is the discounts. And for poor kids in particular, we know this from the economists, they're really good at understanding short-term costs. They have a much harder time thinking about long-term benefits because they've got needs right now. They've got their own kids to support or their parents to support. They've got to work to make, you know, to make ends meet. So saying to them, you know, down the road, this is a great thing for you to do, but you know, you got to make a ton of financial sacrifice now, which any poor kid who's going to college is making a short-term financial sacrifice because they're not working. They're in school. You got to make the case as to why it's worth it and why it's affordable, how it's affordable. I agree with you, Carol. Absolutely. People see the dollar numbers, the big, you know, the huge swimming in debt numbers. Well, you know, if you parse the debt issue, for example, you discover that a lot of it is from graduate programs. It's from law school and medical school. Those are the kinds of places where people are incurring debt. Shame on the University of Southern California. Its graduate program in social work charges $100,000 in tuition. Social work. The average public university graduate who graduates with, who takes out financial aid, graduates with less than $30,000 in debt. That's a non-trivial amount of money, but it isn't the kind of madness that people imagine. And here again, I think the way in which you can deal with that, the debt issue, which I think is also important to communicate, by saying, you know, if you graduate and you get a low-income job, we're not going to dun you for money. If you graduate and you do something in the public service, we're going to give you a break on the, we're not going to ask you to repay money if you're working in the public service. And if you're earning more than poverty income wage, we'll set a limit, 5% of your disposable income, not your rent, not your healthcare costs, and that'll be the amount that you pay. You can get that message across, which basically says you can afford it. And that's the basic. You can afford it now, you'll be able to afford it later. And that's a very simple, it's a very simple way of putting a very important message to people, because they get scared off by sticker price. They get scared off by all the discussions of trillions of dollars in student debt.
Yeah, I would love to see debt-free college. And George, you may remember when you were Chancellor of Santa Cruz, we had a really interesting discussion in the Council of Chancellors meeting about this very idea and how you could do it. And if you had a public service program in which you forgave debt for students who gave 2 years of public service, say, you could have debt-free college. But I think that we have to, I'm troubled by the amount of debt, even the, you know, the comparatively low amounts of average amounts of debt that University of California students incur. It's still difficult for people just starting out in their careers to have that burden of debt. So I think we have to figure out a way that we can that we can either have income limited repayment or debt forgiveness because of public service that will relieve the burden of debt. It also, I think, I don't think that people have written as complicatedly as I wish they did about the debt issue. That this has also been a period of time where there's a lot of cheap money and enormous inflation of housing values. So even for relatively wealthy families, it's attractive to take college debt. So I wish there were both more refined analysis and a more complex understanding of the issue of debt.
No, I agree absolutely. And I do think you can make, I think it's a complex issue which you can simplify. And you said it already. If you go into public service, we're going to forgive your debt. If you're not making a lot of money, we're going to forgive your debt. If you're making more than middle class income, then the debt is going to be based on your disposable income, not the payment for your necessities. So in brief, you can afford college and the debt is not going to overwhelm you. That's the message you want to get out. Now, absolutely, you need to do the kind of really rich, fine-grained analysis to figure out, okay, how much are we talking about? How do you pay for this, et cetera? But the message you want to communicate can be as simple as the one that you offered up first, and then I just reiterated.
Yeah, there's a really interesting question in the chat from the audience. In the US, some universities and some students get federal support, but most public spending on higher education comes from the states. Is a 50-front higher education policy a problem or an opportunity? I think it's an opportunity, not a problem, but it's an unequal opportunity depending on the politics and the resources of the state.
No, absolutely. I mean, again, figuring out the granular calculations in terms of who pays for what, very complicated. But, and a new administration, if fingers crossed, we have a new administration, starts sort of addressing all the inequities. This is certainly one of them. And it's, you don't want to reward, you want to be careful about who you're rewarding. You don't want to reward rich parents who take out a lot of debt because they're looking forward to debt forgiveness down the road. You don't want to regard states that are systematically underinvested in higher education by giving them more federal dollars. And you need to do that in a context of the federal system, a Congress in which Wyoming, which has fewer people by far than the Bay Area, has 2 senators, and so does California. So figuring out how you work out that compromise is going to produce a 500-page piece of legislation that's going to accomplish what it is that the questioner rightly is asking about.
One of the things that concerns me is that there are so many huge challenges confronting the country. I worry a lot that higher education is just not, even though I see higher education as absolutely fundamental to our continuing competitiveness and excellence as a country, I worry that it's just not going to rise to the level of attention in either federal policy or state policy that it really deserves.
No, I think that's right. I want to pick up the last question from a student, which is if we fund, taxpayers will fund K-12 schools, what about universities? And my hunch is, depends on which way the country goes. So at one point, kindergarten was a non-public function for a bunch of reasons to pay for kindergarten. Early education is now on the cusp. Once upon a time, not so very long ago, people thought early education was babysitting, and why is it that the government should pay for babysitters? They can get minimum wage. And as people began to understand how important early education was to the development of healthy and intellectually productive kids, how it can change the arc of a person's life, then funding began to increase. If people begin to get, somehow, people begin to get the message that we are, to go back to the point that was being made earlier, we're losing, out to other countries because of our failure to graduate more students. And they understand a point that was made in a really complicated economic analysis by two Harvard economists called Education versus Technology, the Great Race. They conclude that the reason America was in such great shape up to 1970 wasn't because of the technology, it was because of the expansion of higher education.
Right.
Well, if that's true, then presumably the opposite is true. The fewer students we're graduating proportionally, the worse off we're going to be. And here again, we go back to the point that you made, Carol, at the beginning of the hour, which is that as students start looking different from taxpayers, as the generation of folks who are going to college are students who are poor and not white, then middle-class white families are going to be more reluctant to support them. And somehow, those taxpayers who've got the money need to be persuaded that it is in their interest and in the national interest to fund them, that they need to understand that by doing good, they will be doing well. And that's, again, it's a message that needs a messenger. And perhaps you put, just to do a little lobbying, you put Pete Buttigieg, for example, in the education secretary's chair. He would make the case, and did in his campaign for the kind of policies that we're talking about. So let's see what happens. We can do better than we're doing now. There's so much that needs to be repaired. And I think people need to understand this. If Joe Biden wins, there's so much repair work to be done that we have to be patient about this set of issues. Higher education is very important to us. We're in it. But at the risk of being misunderstood, I think higher education will need to wait its turn before it winds up being repaired in the way that it ought to be repaired financially.
Yeah, there's a great question in the chat. Could advances in remote learning help reduce some of the additional costs of higher education? For example, campus housing activity fees. I think that's such a wonderful question. One of the things the pandemic has done is made certainly me aware, and I think a lot of people aware of the rigidities of higher education, the fact that we are so travel and place dependent, that so much of the structure of higher education is imagining 4 years of a student body, mostly between 18 and 22, in residence at a college or university. And that isn't the pattern of people's lives anymore. And the fact that we're so bound to these rigidities in our structures, I think, is reducing access to higher education. So I think that the advances in remote learning can help us expand access and can make higher education more available to, say, working adults. It will enable a kind of flexibility or elasticity of place that would be better suited to the pattern of many people's lives. However, it's a myth, and it's so important that people understand this, that remote education is cheaper than in face-to-face education. The structure of our faculty is exactly the same. We're actually investing more in remote education, both last semester and this semester, than we were in face-to-face education. But it is true that you, it's not that people live free anywhere, but that you can save, presumably, living expenses. But I think the great benefit that advances in remote learning offers is just more flexibility and more access for individual students.
Absolutely. I look at what the University of Central Florida did, and I spent some time there, and I wrote about them in the college dropout scandal. They figured out something that the chancellor and the university have figured out, that you can't just take the courses that you had, the in-person courses, and plunk a camera in front of them and think that's enough, right? This is not the sage and the stage world. I mean, I'm teaching a class which is a discussion-focused class with 75 or 80 undergraduates. It's a challenge to do. The one thing you cannot do online is you can't read the room. There's no dynamic among all of the students, no feeling about what's happening, what that community looks like. It's much harder to create a sense of community at a distance than it is on campus. But reality is, as you say, there are a lot of students for whom spending a lot of time in one place, sopping up the college experience is not a realistic option. And I think what we will wind up with after this experience with online learning is much more of a hybrid model than we've had before, and not just at the sort of middle tier institutions, but at the elite institutions as well. Because there are certainly very, very, very able students who would benefit greatly from a Cal education, but who can't come to campus and spend 4 years living in Berkeley. And again, I think we're learning that fact, and we are learning how to teach in a very different way. I spent an hour on the phone yesterday with someone talking through, okay, how can I do this? How can I engage students? What can I do to create, a sort of framework for the curriculum that they will, that will make sense to them in the context of a non-physical presence? What can I do to begin to compensate for the lack of personal connection? The answer to that, by the way, is breakout rooms. I love breakout rooms. Yeah. You can be the dictator of takeout rooms. You don't have to worry about where students are going for conversations. You just press a button and off they go, and they talk, and you can wander into those rooms and participate in the conversation. So you can do some things. And the data show that if you do online education right, it's almost as effective as in-person education, vanishingly different in terms of its outcomes. And the best model is the hybrid model, in which students who want to come to campus will do so, and those who can't or don't want to don't have to. A lot of Cal students would be interested in spending, say, a semester here and then going back home or back wherever they were to do a remote semester. Those are all possibilities that I think the pandemic has opened up in higher education. It certainly is a devastation on every front, but here at least there's some learning that's going to be carryover learning.
There's a really interesting question in the chat. Could scale reduce cost of higher education without diluting quality? Absolutely. That's, the secret of public universities is scale. And I think some of the most interesting schools in the United States right now are doing experiments with scale. However, you have to resist the kind of illusion that you don't have to invest to have scale, that to have quality, you have to invest. But scale is a way of being able to do things more efficiently in financial terms. The colleges that are really struggling right now in the pandemic are very small liberal arts colleges. They just don't have the scale to make their financial model succeed. Public universities, for that reason, I think are going to, though challenged, are going to do okay, because finally scale really helps you with more stable finances.
I think it's at the same time, it's really important, again, to emphasize the need for personal connections, the need to create community.
Right.
Arizona State University is the biggest in the country. They have 70-odd thousand students.
Yeah.
But they build small communities amid that big community. Nobody identifies with Arizona State University except at football Saturdays. They identify with a cohort of students. They identify with a particular program, with a small group of faculty. And that's what you need to build if you're going to provide the advantages of scale and couple them with the importance of connectedness. Otherwise, a big impersonal university is a recipe for lots more dropouts.
Well, bringing the conversation back to tuition for the moment, one idea that's been floated a lot recently around the country, and certainly in California, is the idea of cohort-based tuition.
Yeah.
So that if you're going to have tuition, why not guarantee the amount of that tuition for any entering student for the duration of their time in college? And if you're going to raise tuition, raise it only for incoming students. Would either or both of you like to comment on the cohort model?
I think the cohort model has a lot of interest to it. And if it's the only way we can get tuition increases after, what is it, 8, 9 years of frozen tuition, we should go for it. But I think there's something to be said for that predictability. However, I've seen studies that show that if the University of California had raised its tuition modestly over, I can't remember what the period was, I think since the 1990s, we would currently have lower tuition than we have now, and there would be more money in the University of California system. So the thing that's bad for higher education and is also bad for families is this real jumps in tuition, then stagnation, then big jumps again. So I think we need a predictable tuition increase policy, and cohort tuition is certainly an interesting alternative.
And it's important for families. Predictability is important for families, and it's important for the institution, because it's very hard to plan. If you're sitting in the chancellor seat, it's hard to do planning when you don't know, what's going to come down the pike, and whether or not some higher education administrator offends some important state education officials and they decide to punish the university for doing X, Y, Z. Or it's a bit like playing Monopoly. You don't know when you're going to land in the go to jail card, or you're going to land in the strike it rich card. That doesn't work. I'm really intrigued by that study, but it makes a whole lot of sense. That a slow, steady rise. And I think you could modify the cohort model by building in at least a cost of living increase, so that people, which is a standard item for people to deal with elsewhere. I appreciate how much this kind of financial insecurity weighs on people. If you ask Cal students, what is your biggest concern? 75% of them say money.
Yeah.
And that means, and that's not just overall cost. I mean, it is, we don't know from one moment to the next what's going to happen in terms of what our lives are looking like. Not the tuition, because the tuition has been frozen, but the folks who are raising those questions, need more support than they're getting. They need it for living expenses as well as for tuition. And we need both taxpayers and well-to-do families to pay for it. Once upon a time, here's an inconvenient truth for the University of California. The schools to which the poorest students go, that is the community colleges, get the least amount of money. And the schools to which the wealthiest students go on average, that is the university system, get the most amount of money. So the funding of higher education is regressive. It's one of those little secrets that one doesn't really want to share. But it's not an argument for cutting back the University of California. It's an argument for supporting community, for looking at the reasons why this is true, which are complicated, but also looking for how it is that you use that those community colleges become engines of opportunity for students who then go to places like the University of California, which for a whole variety of reasons are going to spend more money on them.
Oh, go ahead, Carol.
I was just going to read another question from the chat, which is kind of interesting. The US is now relying more on imports of graduate students and researchers, engineers, and the government kind of gave up on undergraduate education. Is that a factor for lack of higher education funding? Let me only speak for the state of California. I think the extraordinary competitiveness in terms of admissions of the most the most competitive campuses, Berkeley and UCLA, leads to a kind of lack of support for higher education. So I see a very, very important factor in reversing this is expanding of capacity so people feel it's more available. There's another question in the chat high above that relates to this. If taxpayers are willing to provide free education up to high school, why can't we do that for higher education? I think the answer is what I just said. K-12 is seen as universal. Higher education is not seen as universal. So that's why I think people are not willing to, they feel like they're not necessarily participating in the benefit.
It ought to be so easy to sell higher education to the public. Everybody, every person that you'd be talking to either has a higher education, they've got kids, they want to have higher education, they have neighbors that they've seen have benefited from higher education. It shouldn't be as hard a sell, particularly in a progressive state like California, as it has turned out to be. I'm hoping that, here that case can be made, because California is in a whole lot better shape financially to think about what it might do in terms of increasing funding for higher education than Washington is at this point. And a whole lot more politically receptive to thinking about that. And here again, I would say to the University of California generally, and to Berkeley and UCLA in particular, it is so, you get no points in Sacramento for being the Berkeley Chancellor. In fact, it's so easy to beat up. This is what I think you're talking about, Chancellor. So easy to beat up on those schools. Why should we be paying for all those, those elite snobby schools? And the community colleges work together and develop a common plan for what higher education funding should look like. What ties are being developed among those sectors, graduation rates, and what efforts are being made to close the gap in graduation rates between poor and minority students on the one hand, and middle class and white students on the other hand. You can do that. If you basically what I'm talking about is, it's Clark Kerr Master Plan for Higher Education 2021. And that requires, the kind of statesmanship that I think is out there in those systems, is out there in the leadership of those systems. This is the old Ben Franklin story. We're going to hang together or hang separately. And this is a moment, again, because, if Joe Biden winds up being elected president, the ripples of that, the positive ripples, are going to affect so many aspects of our lives. It's a moment for universities and community colleges to come together and say, here's what California needs. And now is the right time to recognize it. We have 1 million fewer jobs by 2030, fewer college-educated students by 2030 than we need, according to the Public Policy Institute of California study done a few years ago. We need to close that gap. Here's how we're going to do it. And you stand up on the stage with the heads of those systems and with some of the chancellors and presidents of those colleges, and you make the case. I think if higher education has got a chance of expanding its budget and getting the state to accept a greater responsibility for higher education as a public good, it's got to be done that way. The University of California, as an institution, does not have a lot of clout in a place where most of the legislators and most of their constituents went to Cal State. So they didn't go to UC. If all of a sudden all the UC graduates were to vanish from the state of California, we would have a hard time. If all of the Cal State graduates were to vanish, we would be brought to a dead halt. No police, no teachers, no firemen, no nurses. And we need to recognize that we really do have common interests, and we need to work together to make higher education better funded, more highly regarded set of institutions in the state of California.
We've talked a lot about California and the funding that comes to California from the state or from tuition, but in the United States, as compared to other parts of the world, relatively little funding, or a small fraction of the funding, comes from the federal government to public higher education. In particular, the federal government's primary role in public higher education has been Pell Grants for the very poorest students, student loans to provide opportunities for students that can't pay up front for their education, or supportive research at universities. There's very little direct support for public universities at all within the United States. Do you think that that's something that needs to change moving forward, or is it fine to leave this matter to the states in the hopes that the states will do a better job?
I tend to think it's fine to leave the matter to the states. I really would be very concerned about the prospect of more federal regulation of higher education. I think that's an issue that's better left to the states, and I think it's one of the real sources of strength in our system. I've been struck by conversations largely at the Center for Studies in Higher Education at the not always happy relationships in countries where higher education is a federal issue. Not always happy relationships between their ministries of higher education and their colleges and universities, and in most countries outside the universities.
Yeah, the example that struck me that's totally in line with what you're talking about is Denmark had a conservative government and an education minister who said, universities demonstrate to us the practical value of every one of your courses, or we're going to cut that course. And they could do that because of the fact that it's a unitary system. I think the federal government should be providing more generous funding for students in partnership with the states, and focusing its money on the students who need it most, and providing research funds for areas that are of national interest, which is particularly in the STEM fields. That's enough of a lift for Washington. And I agree with Carol, leave it to the states to figure out what their institutions should look like. Because what we don't want is Betsy DeVos deciding for us what the rules ought to be that accompany dollars from Washington.
So we just have a few minutes left in today's discussion, and I think there's a few takeaways, and I want to give you each an opportunity to have the last word. But some of the takeaways that at least I'm getting from this discussion is, number one, free tuition is not a good idea, that the state and the federal government would be much better off investing in higher education and investing in the kinds of services and support that students really need in order to get students, the largest number of students, through college. And so I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to say a few final words on the subject before we end today's discussion.
Well, thank you, George. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for the opportunity. And I always like talking with David about higher education. I think you've said it all. That, and maybe I'll go back to the statement with which I started. That I think that asking should college be free is just the wrong question. That what we should be doing is trying to figure out what the proportion should be of financial responsibility for what college costs and how those costs should be distributed. And I completely agree, much better to invest in generous financial aid for our neediest students, as well as services that help students succeed.
So you might think, listening to this conversation, that Carol and I had rehearsed this, because there might be the room for the disagreement between us is infinitesimal. And I think that's an important point, because we come to this with such different backgrounds. I mean, Carol has this wealth of experience, not at running a large public university and running a small liberal arts college. And she has spent her entire career in higher education as a professor, as an administrator in the public and private sector. I've taught. I've been an administrator briefly, but I've spent a lot of time looking at campuses around the country that in one way or another are addressing the kind of problems that we're talking about. And so I've used some of those examples in the conversation. And what's interesting is I come back from those travels saying exactly the same thing as Carol is saying as chancellor of this institution. And I think that, I hope that reinforces the message that George and Carol have delivered already, which is let's think about education as a public good, not just a private good, and let's think about it in terms of lifting up and supporting the folks who need it most.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Carol. This has been a delightful conversation. And to those of you out there, thank you for joining.